Gurdjieff Remembered by Fritz Peter. First published in 1965 by Victor Gollancz. This is the first American edition, 1971. This book is dedicated to Victor Gollancz. Chapter 1. I had spent about 4.5 years of my early adolescence as a resident student in Fontainebleau, France, at George Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, also known as the Gurdjieff Institute, or more familiarly, La Prairie, during the years 1924 to 1929. I left there at the age of 15 to return to Chicago and my family, which, at that time, consisted of my mother, Lois, my stepfather, Bill, and my half-sister, Linda, then about 7 years old. My departure had been a difficult one in many ways, for various reasons, mostly because of my mother's long illness. I had been legally adopted by Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson, my mother's sister, and it was through them that I had gone to live at the Gurdjieff School. When I decided to return to America, it became necessary to break that adoption, a process which involved considerable legal and personal unpleasantness. My arrival in America was further complicated by the fact that while I was on the ocean, the now famous stock market crash of 1929 came to a head. Although I had expected that my mother would meet me in New York upon arrival, it did not turn out that way. There was no one at the dock, and I was in the odd position of being a recently unadopted minor who was not permitted to leave the ship unless I could be placed in someone's custody. The authorities put me firmly into the hands of an organization known as the Travelers' Aid Society, whose only solution was to keep me on the ship while they made some attempt to get in touch with my family in Chicago. It was not an auspicious homecoming. I watched as the ship, the Leviathan, at that time the world's largest ocean liner, emptied, and I remained, staring over the railing, like some piece of unclaimed excess baggage. The dilemma was finally solved by the arrival of a man whose name I no longer remembered, who was a business associate of my stepfather, and who claimed me in my family's name. He was a pleasant, sympathetic man, but with very little helpful information. He did not know why my mother was not there, but he did know that I was to be given money, put on a train, and dispatched to Chicago, all of which he accomplished efficiently, so that I found myself on the Broadway Limited, rattling through the night in the direction of Chicago. I had been, and still was, alarmed at my mother's non-appearance at the ship, but assuming that this would be cleared up upon my arrival in Chicago, it did not turn out to be quite so simple. There was no familiar face at the Chicago station. Bewildered, I had visions of once more finding myself in the hands of the Travelers' Aid, and hesitated to ask questions for fear of the resulting aid. After searching the platform nervously, I was approached by a rather formidable-looking middle-aged woman who asked me my name, and upon learning it, told me that she was there in place of my mother, who was ill. I had apparently known this woman as a child, but it was some time before my memory was jogged into any recognition of her. When I questioned her about my mother's illness, she was merely nervous and vague, and told me that my stepfather Bill would explain it all to me when I saw him that evening. Arriving at our apartment on the south side of the city, I found that there were two people I did remember, my half-sister Linda and the colored woman Clara, who had been our nurse and housekeeper when I was a very young boy. Even Clara, however, was mysterious about my mother, so I spent the afternoon waiting impatiently for Bill's return from his office and the moment when my questions would be answered. When he did arrive around about 6 in the evening, the mystery continued. He merely greeted me with some reserve and told me that he would talk to me later that evening. Then, to my surprise, he mixed a cocktail and asked me if I smoked and drank. I replied honestly that while I did not make a habit of either, I had been known to do both. He smiled and offered me a drink and a cigarette, both of which I accepted. He asked me a great many unimportant questions about my trip across the ocean, etc., but kept the conversation rigorously general. By this time I had accepted the fact that I would get no information until he chose to give it to me, so I did not press him. However, it did seem a long time before we had finally finished dinner, and my sister had been put to bed. I had already understood that she had to be disposed of before he would talk to me. When we were at last alone in the large living room at the luxurious apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, Bill's nervousness seemed to increase. and he offered me another drink and a cigarette, which I again accepted. After a great deal of fumbling, hemming and hawing, he finally sat down facing me, and with a stern expression on his face, produced the document that had been prepared in Paris to dissolve the adoption, a copy of which had been handed to me as I boarded the ship at Cherbourg. I had read it, of course. Not only had I read it and been shocked by it, but I also remembered Jane's words when she had given it to me on the gangplank of the tender. "You may be shocked when you read this," she had said, "but try to realize my position and remember that it was very difficult to break the adoption without some reason that would be legally valid." The essence of the document was that I was being expelled from the Gurdjieff school because I was morally unfit. The phrase had no specific meaning for me at 15, and while I had been genuinely shocked and hurt by it, I had taken some meager comfort from Jane's explanation and, in the course of the trip, had finally assumed that the document had to be worded that way for, as she had said, legal reasons, which were beyond my capacity to understand at that age. How easily do the young place their trust in adults. In addition to that document, I had with me the last letters I had received from Lois and Bill, letters of welcome and glowing descriptions of their preparations for my future. I would be sent to college. I had nothing to worry about now. I had been away too long. It was time I had a good home, and so on ad infinitum. I had already accepted and believed those welcoming missives, and my reading of the legal papers had not discouraged me. Sure, it had worried me, but I counted on the love and trust of my welcoming family, and completely discounted the possible effect of the, to me, meaningless legal phraseology. Bill, document in hand, corrected my mistaken assumptions in very short order. He began to acknowledge his and Lois's letters, reminding me, however, that they had been written before the document had been received. I said, in all my 15-year-old innocence, that I did not see why the meaningless legal phrases should alter anything, and also quoted to him what Jane had said about it. He thought this over briefly, and then said, to my astonishment, that he had thought over the whole question and had come to the conclusion that, since Jane was, as he knew, a difficult person, there was some possibility that she had distorted or exaggerated the facts. Exaggerated? I asked him what he meant by that, and he replied quickly that there must obviously be some truth in the document, but that he would like to hear my version of what I had done in order to be expelled. When I said that I did not know what he meant, and that, in any case, I had not been expelled, he said that nothing could now be gained by lying. For his sake, perhaps, I had better point out that he was a lawyer and had great respect for legal documents. In any event, after the preliminary conversation, during which we had arrived at some kind of dead end, he took another tack and asked me if I understood the meaning of the words morally unfit. I said that I knew roughly that they signified something unpleasant, but that they had no precise meaning for me. He then produced a long letter from Jane which, as he pointed out quite unnecessarily, amplified the meaning of these words. I sat in a kind of frozen horror as he read excerpts from the letter which, according to him, had been the cause of my mother's hospitalization a few days before, because of a complete nervous collapse. According to the letter, there was very little question but that I was some sort of sexually depraved delinquent, given principally to the practice of corrupting other smaller children. When he had finished reading, I remained silent, and he then poured me another drink and asked me if I realized the problem which now faced him. I shook my head dumbly and said I did not know what he meant. So he amplified his position by pointing out to me that if the allegations in Jane's letter were true, he could not, of course, safely allow me to inhabit this apartment in company with his 7-year-old daughter, my half-sister. With a glance at the drink in my hand, he also mentioned that he did not know of any other 15-year-old boys who smoked and drank. I then took a deep breath and a drink, and asked him if he believed that the allegations, his word, were true. He said that he was reserving his opinion until he had heard my side of the story. I had been told that the Gurdjieff school was a preparation for life, of a different and better sort than could ever be found in ordinary schools or under ordinary life conditions. While this may have been true, I did not at the moment feel prepared for the problem facing me. After some deliberation, perhaps the preparation had been better than I realized, I said that it seemed to me in general that people believed what they wished to believe. I added that obviously, if I admitted to the crime suggested by the letter, he would believe me. On the other hand, if I denied them, since the charges had been made, he would always wonder if I were telling the truth or not. I said further that since I had no way of proving my innocence, the only course left to me was to say nothing, that I would leave it up to him, not to decide which one of us, Jane or myself, had been telling the truth, but simply to decide whether or not Jane had been honest. Thwarted and frustrated by this attitude, Bill pressed me for 3 hours for an affirmation or a denial, but I remained resolutely firm and told him that I was leaving the decision squarely in his hands and on his conscience without any further comments. By midnight he had decided to continue to reserve his decision, and told me that temporarily I would be allowed to stay in the apartment. He added that he had arranged for someone to take me to visit my mother the following day. I slept that night in the library with a great many misgivings. The world that night seemed very large indeed and equally hostile. The by now to me famous legal document was only the beginning. I did see my mother the next day, and while she greeted me with the kind of affection that was natural to a mother who had not seen her son for a long time, the seed of suspicion had been sown in fertile soil. She was not in the hospital for very long, and I was very happy when she came back to live with us. But it also came to mean that I was under double surveillance. I don't know exactly what was expected of me, but looking back, it might have resolved the whole problem had I, as it were obediently, either raped my sister or at least initiated her into some strange and reprehensible sexual practices. The fact that I did not, instead of clearing my name, only prolonged the suspense. To add to this, I received, in the course of 3 or 4 weeks after my arrival in Chicago, several letters from people who had been mutual friends of Jane and of my family, and therefore of mine. Jane's coverage of the events leading to my return to America had been as complete as possible, as if she had been a one-woman Associated Press. The content of all these letters was more or less identical. The writer, having heard from Jane, was sorry to hear of my progress in delinquency, and felt that it would be better, for all concerned, if I would not make any attempts to get in touch with them. Having by this time resigned myself to the obvious hostility of the adult world, I did not express very much feeling when I received these letters. I sensed, somehow, that any sort of protest would be useless, and that my only ally, if I had one, was time. In the meantime, certain definite decisions and arrangements had to be made that related to my future. Largely because of the stock market crash, although we seemed to be affluent enough, it was decided that the idea of my going to college was out of the question. However, I would at least have to have a respectable high school diploma. I was enrolled in high school as a senior, in spite of my previous lack of any acceptable or accredited high school training. Apparently certain tests were enough to accomplish this. However, after completing less than one semester, with straight A's except for in zoology, which I loathed and did not pass, it was decided that I could get along without any further formal education or any diploma, and Bill's solution was to offer me a job in his law office. I was to be paid $12 per week, and would have to pay for my own transportation and my laundry. Food would be thrown in without further expenses to me. After I had been working, presumably satisfactorily, for a few months, my mother told me that she had to talk to me about an important decision she would have to make. She found that she could no longer bear life with Bill, and had decided to either divorce him or at least separate from him legally. I was 16 at that time, and the recent events of my life seemed to have come full circle, to a total stop. By the fall of that year, 1930, events had followed events rigorously. After a separation and the beginning of a suit for divorce, I found myself living alone on $15 a week. I had been given a $3 a week raise. Still working in my stepfather's office. My mother and my half-sister had fled to Europe, and when Bill, who had also made a separate trip to Europe on business, returned and found them absent, I found myself out of a job. So by September of 1930, all the threads had been cut. I was then living alone without a job on the accumulated savings from my small weekly salary. What does all this have to do with George Gurdjieff? Any reader may well ask. In a sense, nothing, except that having trusted and perhaps worshipped him for about 5 years. My feelings for and about him were now strongly reinforced. No one else in the world, or in my experience of the world, seemed willing to give me house room, and while the knowledge of his existence was a distant comfort to me, he was somewhere in France, about 4,000 miles from Chicago.